the CWAY, the princess herself, Melody Shuman.
My subject that I'm going to be talking about today is a brand new subject, and it was inspired by the last CWAY event in Miami. Just really quickly, a show of hands, did anybody attended the CWAY in Miami? Awesome. So what we want to do is constantly have these seminars where we're synergizing, we're networking, we're talking about things in our business, and as we come up with new ideas and new avenues to explore, we want to explore them with you, do all the research and development, and then bring it together in events like this. So with that said, how to be a three-dimensional instructor. Now the reason why this came up is because we were talking about particularly instructors who have fantastic personalities, fantastic martial arts skills, just love martial arts all around, just like myself. But at the same time, you struggle every single day to be motivated, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. We've all hit a burnout factor, is that correct? Absolutely, yes. And a lot of the times where we hit the burnout factor is number one, in innovation, and then number two, dealing with your struggling students. So this particular subject, since I only have 50 minutes, I'm just going to tap onto one of the biggest areas, problem areas of a martial arts school, is to how to deal with problem students. Those students that stress you out, the students that give you the gray hairs. I like to dye my hair, so I don't have any gray hair right now. Nick, you might want to think about doing that. I'm just kidding. So today we're going to talk about how to be a three-dimensional instructor with dealing with your challenges within your class. And then the next CWAY event, we'll talk about how to be a three-dimensional instructor on innovating your program. So let's talk about being a three-dimensional instructor. Here's a step-by-step overview of how to fix those problem students or those problem areas within your school or within the classroom. Number one, you want to identify who is having challenges in your class. If you don't know who is struggling, you're just teaching and experiencing these days where you're just like, man, those classes just didn't go well, and you're not specifically saying who specifically was having a hard time, you're not a three-dimensional instructor. After you identify who's having a hard time, the next thing you want to do is determine what they're struggling with. If you just say, look, this kid isn't following along, he's not really participating very well, he makes my day very stressful. I get excited, I have my class planner, I go out there to teach, and then boom, Gabe shows up. And we all have those Gabes in class, right? The ones that you're just like, oh man, he just ruins the chemistry of the class. He's probably a fantastic kid, but there's something about him that ruins that synergy in the class and it slows down that momentum. So what we want to do is we want to find out what is Gabe struggling with. Then after you determine what he's struggling with, then you want to determine when is he struggling. Is it just the beginning of class? Is it during the mat chats? Is it during the game? Is it the entire class? From there, you can figure out where the best place is to correct the problem. If he's just wiggling around during like your mat chats, then you can correct it during class. If he seems to have consistent behavioral problems, then obviously you're going to want to talk with the parent, maybe do some type of conference. If he has physical limitations and intellectual limitations, then of course you're going to want to jump into private lessons. So that would be the next thing, is understanding why is it important to correct the problem. Now, one of the things that I have figured out at my school is the thing that stresses me out is the children who give me a hard time. But I'm starting to notice also that when we lose students, it's not necessarily because the student doesn't like martial arts anymore, it's because they don't like the environment. So if you have problem children in your school, it's going to affect the motivation of the rest of the students. It's also going to affect the parents. And I've said this time and time again on stage, that I would rather a parent be upset with me because I removed their disruptive child out of class, then have other parents upset with me because I allowed the disruptive child to continue to train. And this is where we have to make big decisions in our class. So from there, and when you understand why it's important to correct a problem, then you can conclude how to correct a problem. And I'm going to take you through step by step right here. Okay, so let's talk about number one. Who is struggling during class? Now this is a very important question that the school owners need to ask. Is the entire class struggling? Is it just a particular group or rank of kids that are struggling in one class, or is it an individual student? You have to ask yourself this question, because if the entire class is not behaving very well, it may be the instructor. You may have to look at the instructor and say the instructor either needs more training or they're not qualified for this particular class. I've made the mistake too many times of taking my high energy, talented martial arts instructors and putting them with my 3- and 4-year-olds and saying, you know what, you're cute, you have a great personality, you've got a lot of martial arts talent, and they just tank the class. They just don't know how to work with 3- and 4-year-olds. It's like taking a square peg and trying to pound it in a circle hole. You can't do it. So if your entire class is always struggling, look at the instructor and take steps to correct the problem. If it's just a particular group or ranks of ages within that class, you may want to consider splitting up your ages. For example, for a very long time, anybody, raise your hand if you're running the Little Ninja program? in your school? Okay, very cool. For a very long time, I put 3 to 6-year-olds in the exact same class and realized that it was very, very hard to run, even with 3 and 6-year-olds. And then I started realizing that in that particular class, the 5 and 6-year-olds were doing well. It was the 3 and 4-year-olds who were always picking their nose and rolling around on the floor, and one falls, the other one falls on the ground. And I was thinking it was me, then I was thinking it was the students, and then I realized it was that particular age group. When I started realizing that, I pulled my 3 and 4-year-olds out of the program, plugged them into their new program, and now all is well as it can be. Of course, if you're noticing that one individual student is struggling in class, this is where you can become a very good 3-dimensional instructor. I'm taking my teaching and I'm taking my consulting to the next level. Because for a very long time, I would tell you guys, because I see a lot of familiar faces, you have a struggling student in class, you kick them out. Right? Simple as that. That way you don't have to worry about dealing with the problem. As I'm getting older and more mature and starting to really understand science and psychology as it applies to teaching martial arts, I'm starting to learn we can correct this problem within the school. We don't necessarily have to kick them out yet. So let's talk about that a little bit more. If you have a struggling student, you want to ask yourself, when are they struggling? Or what are they struggling with? This is very important. This is where you really become 3-dimensional. And this is where I love when my staff doesn't just say, hey, look, Gabe is giving me a hard time in class. It's, hey, look, Gabe is distracting all the kids. He's not listening, and he always interrupts during class. It's a big difference between a kid like Gabe who always interrupts and who's always distracted and always interrupting or not listening compared to another student like Libby who has a very hard time with her balance and her coordination. She has apraxia, so she's very low tone. So the drills aren't always appropriate for her. So being able to identify, are they not listening? Are they distracting the students? Or are they just not putting in enough effort? Or are they having trouble retaining information? Or is it because they're uncoordinated? Do they have weak moves? Are they unbalanced? If you can start to identify these, you start to become a 3-dimensional instructor. From there, you want to find out, now, when are they struggling? Are they struggling just during the warm-ups? Does it take them a little bit to get started? Are they struggling during the mat chats? Are they struggling in between the transition of the activities? Is it during the drills? Is it during the curriculum review? Is it during the game? This is very important because if you have disruptive students, we all have those students who or look at me, look at me, look at me, that need all the attention. So the beginning of class, they always have this high anxiety because they're so excited, they're hyperactive, they're ADD. It takes them a while to get into the groove. Is that correct? Some of the students, the warm-ups are acting very silly, but as they get regimented in class, then they start to do really well. Of course, we have some students that during the mat chat, they just can't sit still. They can't listen, they have ADD, they're not paying attention. Or we have some students that do really well, but in between transition of the drills, whenever they have downtime, that's where they're distracting others, or that's where they're not listening or paying attention. Or you have students that are struggling because in the drills, they don't have the proper skills that they need. They maybe have apraxia, or they have some type of physical, intellectual limitation. The same thing during the curriculum review, when they're reviewing the curriculum. If they're struggling at this part, this is very important. This is right here, I identify, if my students are struggling when we review the curriculum, they don't belong in the group class. This is where private lessons will come into play to make sure that they earn their stripes necessary to move to the next belt level. Or maybe is it just during the game? Once the game comes around, they're beat, they're burnt out, and they're ready to be silly. If it's during the whole thing, during the mat chat, during the warm-up, in between the activities, during the drills, during the curriculum review, and during the games they're giving you a really hard time, then you know that maybe they aren't meant for the group class. Okay, so what we want to do is talk about where's the best place to correct the problem. So if it's just during the mat chat or if it's in between the drills, you can correct it during class. You can have a conversation with them. You can prompt good behavior using the 10 laws of instruction that we've talked about at the last Champions Way seminar. Or maybe you need to do a parent conference, or maybe you need to do private lessons. Being a 3-dimensional instructor means you know the best place to correct this problem. If you just say, Gabe is distracting, and during class I've tried to correct him, so let's just go ahead and kick him out. Well, that was me circa 10 years ago. That's probably where I would be. But now what I'd ask my instructors is, Gabe is really struggling. What do you think would work best? Do you think that he needs private lessons to regiment him, or do you think he needs a parent conference? Well, typically with Gabe, it's behavioral. So we would just do parent conferences with Gabe, and we'd probably do regular parent conferences that you can also charge as a private lesson to help recorrect that behavior. They have to work together with you, if that makes sense. Or if it's a physical intellectual limitation, then you want to do private lessons. I know I'm rushing through this because at the end I'm going to add on, we're going to talk about how to correct specific students. So I'm going to ask you guys questions on students that you're struggling with, and we'll network and talk about how we can recorrect them. Okay, so let's talk about very important on being a 3-dimensional instructor. And this is particularly not for the school owners, but these are for all these instructors or the soon-to-be instructors. Raise your hand if you're a newbie instructor or you've only been teaching for about a year or two? Go ahead, you can raise your hand high, don't be shy. Okay, this is especially important for you guys because there are times where you're just gonna get used to your rhythm, get used to teaching, and correcting these problems are overlooked. But you need to understand that it's very important to correct these problems because you want to think about these things right here that we're talking about. Is it limiting the student's progress? So if you have distractive students, or you have students who are very physically uncoordinated or intellectually, they have a hard time retaining the information, they're going to slow your class down. And eventually, it's going to affect the entire class. So you as a new instructor have to understand that this is very important, that it is recorrected and it is addressed. If you ignore it and just hope that somebody else is going to come in and take care of it, maybe they won't. And then you ignore it, somebody else hopefully will take care of it, maybe they won't. And that's when your school falls apart. Am I correct, instructors? Yes, because I travel a lot. I go out of the country, I'm over here a lot, so I want to make sure that my staff members, while they're running my classes, they're running them really well, they're addressing these problems so that when I come back, I don't have students limiting other kids' problems, distracting other students, taking away too much of the instructor's attention. These are all very important. If they're distracting other students are not going to learn. If it's taking away too much of the instructor's attention, the students are not going to learn. So you need to understand that that's very important. So let's talk about now how to correct the problem. Number one, you need to identify if it's a social, emotional, intellectual, or physical challenge. This right here is very important because sometimes, again, like I said, we may just say that Gabe has a hard time in class. But is it because he has social problems? Or is Gabe one of those kids who just doesn't have confidence? He doesn't try very hard. He gives up, or he cries when he's losing. That would be an emotional problem. Or does he just not remember something? You say something and it goes in this ear, and it goes right out the other. That means he has an intellectual problem, a hard time retaining information. Or is it because he's kicking and falling on the ground, he doesn't know his left from right, he always forgets to retract his hand, he doesn't snap his knees when he kicks, and he just kind of embarrasses you on the mat, right? Because we all have to agree that your job is to make them look good, right? As a martial arts instructor, your job is to help them grow. You know what their job is? What's their job? What's the kid's job on the mat? Does anybody know? Their job is to make you look good. So if you're making them look good and they look good, then they make you look good. So you're only as good as your worst kid in class, correct? So if you have a kid who's kind of throwing a sidekick out right there, that makes you not look so good. So you have to be able to identify those challenges in class. So once you identify if it's social, so if they're distracting everybody, they're not listening, or they're interrupting you, that is a social problem. Now we have identified and honed in on it. Now we can sit down with them and talk about how to positively interact with each other. We can set up parent conferences. If it still doesn't work after you've talked with them time and time again, whoops, did I do that? I'll let them fix it. If I sit down with the student time and time again and talk to them about not distracting other kids, don't interrupt, please sit still, and it's not corrected after you've talked with them in class, after you've talked with them in a parent conference, maybe even did a couple of private lessons to do some type of social behavioral drills, and it's still not working, that's where you would say, you know what, maybe I'm not qualified to work with this child in a group environment. Now, this is big kid decisions. We have a lot of people here who are adults who don't make those big kids decisions and say, no, I want to teach every single student. I would say that even with my experience, that I would say about 20% of the kids in my area, I'm not qualified to work with in a group environment. This is where you'd want to bring a professional in, okay? Now going on to the next one, if they have low self-esteem, low confidence, they don't try very hard, or they're not always the winner, they're not always the fastest, that is an emotional problem. That can easily be recorrected once you direct your attention towards that emotional problem. This again is being a three-dimensional instructor. Things that you can do is number one, have a parent conference with the student, tell the student that you're there to support them and that you're going to help them. Do private lessons and give them some extra training. Show them what you're going to be doing the next week, the next 2 weeks in class. Run those drills with them, give them extra training so that next week when you run that class, you can have him demonstrate. And he demonstrates and he looks really good, his confidence starts to go up. Then you can recorrect his emotional challenges. If he has a hard time retaining information, he keeps forgetting, goes in this ear, out the other ear, you could do private lessons to help build his retention skills by covering the curriculum in more of a one-on-one environment. Maybe it's not that he is not very smart, it's just that he's not smart when there's a lot of other kids competing for his attention as well. Sometimes he may be too smart. We have a kid in our school, his name's Razzie, He's a rock star because he comes up to me and says, now I know why patience is a virtue, Master Melody, because this little girl kept picking on me and picking on me and picking on me, and I wanted to hit her, but I didn't. I was very patient. I was like, very cool. This kid's 7 years old. His dad's a brain doctor. Just shows you how smart he is. But in class, to keep his attention, I need one of these little laser pointers to shine in his eyes all the time, saying, Razzie, pay attention, because intellectually he has a hard time learning in that environment. One-on-one, when I do private lessons with him, he picks that stuff up really, really quick. This, again, is being a three-dimensional instructor, knowing where your students' strengths are, knowing where their weak spots are. Or is it a physical challenge? Like I said, Libby, one of our students, has apraxia, so she's very low tone, she's very floppy. So we do a lot of private lessons where we focus particularly on exercises that will help her build up her muscle strength. Okay? So after you identify if it's a social, emotional, intellectual, physical challenge, the next thing is set a goal for the student to achieve. If it's behavioral, you say, look, for the next 2 weeks, if you can focus mostly on not interrupting me while I'm talking, not distracting the other students, and listening carefully while we're doing all these drills, then I'll let you wear my black belt for a week to reward you for trying very hard. This is a very good goal to set for the student. So that's where I say create a form of recognition once a problem has been corrected. This works well. There are constantly times where I'm bringing the students in the office, having a conversation with them, providing a reward system set up for them, and the problem is recorrected. You can even do this with students who misbehave outside of the school. If they're having a hard time at school with a student, if they're fighting with students, or if they're fighting with their siblings at home. This is how you correct that problem. So let's talk about being a three-dimensional instructor, and let's relate it towards your specific needs. The first thing is remember that there has to be a healthy balance between structure and discipline in your class, which is your class planners and your curriculum, and that sweet spot in the middle, which is where you have the freedom to improvise and freedom to innovate. And if you have that healthy balance, you can be a fantastic three-dimensional instructor. So let's talk about now being able to know specifically what kids can't do. As you know, in my school, we focus on skill-based training. And even if you do not focus on skill-based training, knowing the 8 skills for each particular age group will help you identify maybe what's not working for your students because it's too hard, or maybe what's too easy. For example, 3- and 4-year-olds, there's 8 particular skills that martial arts can help build that will help them become better and set them up for the next program. Those 8 skills are kicking, punching, blocking, crawling, hopping, running, catching, and rolling. So if you're doing lots of drills targeting that particular stage of development, you're a three-dimensional instructor, and you can use those in your private lessons as well. And you don't have to worry about writing them down because I'll email these to you as well. 5- and 6-year-olds, raise your hand if you know all 8 skills for the 5- and 6-year-old program, if you're running the Little Ninjas. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Anybody know the 5- and 6-year-old skills? Tony, can you name all the 5? I put you on the spot. Focus, teamwork, control, memory, balance, discipline, fitness, coordination. Those are skills that they're building in their stage of development. 7- and 9-year-olds, skills that are appropriate for their stage of development, skills that they're building for the first time are agility, technique, courage, intensity, flexibility, perseverance, speed, and concentration. When you get to the 10 to 14-year-old age group, this is where you're really, really sharp. This is where you have fantastic skills. So you're building skills like dexterity, right, with your basics, being able to do all those chambers, reaction time with your self-defense, being able to not just say, okay, if someone grabs my arm like this, then this is how I get away. Instead, the minute somebody grabs my arm, being able to react. Versatility, which is what forms builds, right? Being able to do multiple patterns in a variety of different ways. Momentum, that's where they do all their jumping and spinning and moving around. Precision, this is where they're doing all their board breaking. Instinct, sparring builds instinct, correct? Strength, it's not just fitness now. 10 and up, they can actually build strength according to their stage of development. And then, of course, we talk about vision, which is seeing the bigger picture, which is your character lessons. So that all applies to being a three-dimensional instructor. So what I wanted to do this part, I wanted to make sure that I had enough time, is open it up to you guys, and let's explore how we can be a three-dimensional instructor in your school with students that maybe are giving you challenges. So does anybody have a student or would like to start it off? Yes, sir.